The fluorescent lights of the Mercy General Emergency Room buzzed like a dying insect. Cold, relentless, indifferent. It was 11:47 on a Tuesday night in November, and a man was being dragged across the floor, face down, hands locked behind his back in steel cuffs. His weathered cheek scraping against white hospital tile as a patrol officer yanked him through the automatic doors by the collar of a jacket that had seen 20 winters. No one moved to help him. A woman in the waiting room pulled her child close. A tired man in a business suit looked up from his phone, grimaced, and looked away. A security guard took one step forward, then stopped. The officer's voice cut through the noise of the room like a blade. "Move! Everyone move back." The man on the floor didn't fight. He didn't scream. He didn't beg. He simply lay there, chest rising and falling, eyes half open, staring at the scuff marks on the tile as if he'd seen far worse floors than this, as if he'd stared up at far worse ceilings, as if somewhere in the fog clouding his mind, he already knew how this story went. He looked like a man the world had already buried. Torn boots, a jacket held together by habit more than thread, skin that told the story of 1,000 nights outdoors, sun-cracked, wind-burned, mapped with the kind of lines you only earn by surviving things you never talk about. His name was Marcus Webb, and in 30 seconds, everything in that emergency room was about to change. Because across the room, frozen mid-stride between a supply cart and a patient bay, a nurse stood perfectly still. She wasn't watching the officer. She wasn't watching the crowd. She was watching him, his forearm, the faded ink just below his elbow, half hidden beneath a tattered sleeve that had ridden up when he was pulled through the doors. Tattoo. Small, worn by time, but unmistakable to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Her face didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes. Something ancient. Something that had nothing to do with medicine or protocol or the chaos of a Tuesday night shift. She set down the clipboard in her hand. She took one step toward him, and the entire room, without knowing why, seemed to hold its breath. Who was this man on the floor? What did that nurse see? And why, in a room full of people trained to respond to emergencies, was she the only one who couldn't look away? Stay with me, because what happens next in the next few minutes of this story will make you question everything you think you know about the people you walk past every single day without ever seeing. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand who Marcus Webb was. Not who he appeared to be, who he actually was, because those are two very different things. If you had passed Marcus on the street that morning, and most people had, without a second glance, you would have seen what they saw. A homeless man, somewhere in his late 50s, maybe older, moving slowly along the edge of the sidewalk the way people do when they've learned not to take up too much space in a world that has quietly made clear they are not wanted. He carried everything he owned in a military-issue duffel bag that was so old the strap had been repaired 3 times with mismatched cord. He wore the same jacket every day, olive green, heavy canvas, the kind they stopped making sometime in the 80s. It had 2 breast pockets, both torn, and a collar he kept turned up against the wind even on warm days. Habit. Some habits don't leave you even when everything else does. He didn't panhandle. That was the first thing people who actually paid attention noticed. He never held a sign, never asked for money. On the corner of 5th and Madison, where he sometimes spent the morning, he would sit with his back against the brick wall of the old post office and watch the street with the kind of patient, measuring stillness that made pigeons land near him without fear. Dogs were always calm around him. Children stared at him with that wide, unfiltered curiosity that adults quickly learn to suppress. One woman, a schoolteacher named Patricia who passed him every morning on her way to work, told her husband that there was something about the homeless man outside the post office that she couldn't explain. He never looked lost, she said. He looked like someone who knew exactly where he was. He just didn't seem to know why he was there anymore. That was the closest anyone had come to the truth. Marcus Webb knew precisely where he was. He had navigated through jungle terrain without GPS. He had read terrain maps in near-total darkness. He had memorized the patrol routes of 3 different enemy outposts from a distance of 800 meters using nothing but a set of field binoculars and a mind trained to catalog every shadow that moved wrong. He had been, for a significant portion of his adult life, one of the most capable men in the most demanding environments on Earth. He was a combat veteran, United States Army, 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan, Ranger qualified, air assault certified. He had served in units whose names he was still not supposed to say aloud in the wrong company. He had done things in the service of his country that most people wouldn't believe were possible, and others that, if they knew, would make them sleep less soundly in the beds that his service helped protect. He had been awarded the Bronze Star. He had been awarded the Purple Heart twice. He had come home to a country that shook his hand at the airport and then quietly forgot he existed. But none of that was visible on the street corner. What was visible to anyone who looked long enough were the small signs. The way he always sat with his back to a wall. Never in the open. Never where someone could approach from behind without being seen. The way his eyes moved in restaurants when someone brought him a meal from the shelter outreach program. Constantly scanning, registering every exit, every face, every shift in body language at the surrounding tables. The way he folded his sleeping bag with the same precise, economical movements every morning. Edges aligned, corners tucked. Long after there was anyone left to inspect it. The way, on the one occasion a drunk man outside a convenience store had grabbed him by the shoulder and shoved him. The way Marcus had turned, planted his feet, and looked at the man with such complete, quiet certainty that the man had stepped back, muttered something, and walked away without fully understanding why his body had made that decision for him. There was a word for what lived behind Marcus Webb's eyes. Competence. Bone-deep, battle-tested, absolute competence. The kind that doesn't disappear when the uniform comes off. The kind that waits. And on the cold sidewalk outside the emergency room at Mercy General, on a Tuesday night in November, something had finally pushed Marcus Webb past the point where waiting was an option. He had collapsed. Not from weakness. From something no one had thought to ask him about. The Mercy General emergency room on a Tuesday night was its own particular kind of organized chaos. Dr. Yolanda Reyes had been running the department for 11 years, and she often said, not entirely joking, that the ER at night was like a small city that only existed in the dark. Its own population, its own economy, its own social order with its own unspoken rules about who got seen first, who got moved to the back, and who got redirected to social services before a doctor ever laid eyes on them. The staff knew each other the way soldiers know each other. Not just names and roles, but rhythms. Who drank their coffee black and who fell apart when the coffee was gone. Who could handle the bad nights and who needed to be quietly redirected away from the pediatric cases when things went wrong. They were good people doing impossible work under impossible conditions. And like most people doing impossible work under impossible conditions, they had developed shortcuts. Mental shortcuts. Visual shortcuts. The kind of rapid triage that happens not on a chart but in the first 3 seconds of looking at someone. The instant, unconscious categorization that determined how much attention a person received before the system sorted them and moved on. It wasn't cruelty. It was survival. But survival has a cost. Officer Daniel Pratt had been on the force for 4 years. He was 27 years old. He worked the downtown corridor, a stretch of 12 city blocks that included 2 shelters, 1 methadone clinic, a bus terminal, and the back entrance to Mercy General, which meant he spent a significant portion of every shift interacting with people in crisis. He wasn't a bad officer. That is important to understand. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't looking for someone to hurt. He was young, and he was tired, and he had answered 11 calls that shift before Marcus Webb, and 9 of those calls had involved people who were intoxicated, or in the middle of a psychotic break, or had been found passed out in a doorway reeking of something he couldn't identify. When the call came in at 11:42, male, approximately 60, collapsed on the sidewalk outside Mercy General. Unresponsive to verbal commands. Aggressive when approached. Daniel Pratt's brain had already begun writing the story before he arrived. He pulled up and saw a man on the ground. Ragged clothing. Disoriented. Muttering things Daniel couldn't parse. He called out. The man didn't respond the way someone who was simply sick would respond. Marcus Webb, in the grip of something that would later turn out to be a diabetic crisis compounded by severe dehydration and the early stages of hypothermia, had raised his arm. Not in aggression. It was a gesture. Something that might have meant anything, that in another context, to another pair of eyes, might have been read as someone reaching for help. Daniel Pratt read it as resistance. He moved fast, and Marcus went down. Inside the ER, the automatic doors burst open and a ripple moved through the room, the particular ripple that happens when something wrong has entered a space. Every head turned, and what everyone saw was what Daniel had already decided they were seeing. A vagrant, causing a scene, being contained. The security guard moved to assist. 2 nurses at the central station glanced over and turned back to their screens. The intake clerk picked up her radio. And then there was Sergeant First Class Elena Vasquez, now going by RN Elena Vasquez, 4 years removed from her last deployment and 3 years into her night shift rotation at Mercy General ER. Elena had been moving between Bay 6 and the supply room when the doors opened. She was carrying a blood pressure cuff in one hand and a patient chart in the other, and she was thinking about the arterial bleed in Bay 3 that Dr. Reyes had just gotten under control, when the movement at the entrance registered in her peripheral vision. She stopped. Her first read of the scene was the same as everyone else's. Then her second read happened. It was faster than thought. It bypassed language entirely. Her eyes went to the man on the floor, not to his clothes or his condition, but to his body. The way his shoulders were set, even pinned to the tile. The way his head was turned, protecting his airway. The instinctual physical discipline that persists even in a body that is shutting down. Then she saw the arm. The sleeve had ridden up to the elbow when he was cuffed. And on the inside of his left forearm, in faded blue-black ink gone soft with age, was a tattoo that Elena Vasquez had last seen on a wall in a firebase common room in Kandahar province in 2009. A unit crest. The wings. The sword. The Latin phrase along the bottom that she had memorized without trying because you don't forget the markings of the people who walked into the same fire you did. She set the chart down. The blood pressure cuff followed. She crossed the room, and as she got closer, she saw the chain around his neck, thin, silver, tucked inside his collar but pulled loose by the fall, with the small metal rectangles that clinked against the tile. Dog tags. Her hand moved without asking permission from her brain. She reached down and turned them over. Webb, Marcus A. U.S. Army. She stayed in a crouch for a long moment. No one in the room understood what was happening. But the air had changed. Get him up on a gurney. Now. Elena's voice came out quiet. Not loud. Not panicked. The specific register of authority that does not require volume because it has never needed it. Daniel Pratt looked up. He was still holding Marcus by the collar, one knee on the floor, positioned the way he'd been trained to control a resistant individual. Ma'am. This man was being belligerent on the officer. Elena was already moving to Marcus's side, 2 fingers at his neck, her eyes on his face. This man is in medical distress. You need to remove those handcuffs right now. Pratt blinked. He resisted when His blood sugar has probably crashed through the floor and his core temperature is dropping. Her voice hadn't changed. Same register. Same absolute calm. Those are not symptoms of intoxication. Those are symptoms of a man who is dying. I need those cuffs off. Something in the way she said it, not as a request, not as an argument, but as simple, non-negotiable fact, made Daniel Pratt reach for his keys. The cuffs came off. Marcus's arms fell to his sides. Elena was already calling across the room. I need a gurney in the entry. I need a glucose kit, a saline 4, and I need someone to get me a warming blanket. Dr. Reyes, Bay 4, please. The room, which had been suspended in a strange collective paralysis, suddenly broke into motion. 2 nurses appeared. A gurney rolled from somewhere behind the station desk. The intake area transformed in seconds into something that looked much more like what it was supposed to be. But getting Marcus Webb onto the gurney was not simple. He was a large man, 6'1", even wasted down by months of irregular meals and outdoor exposure. And whatever was happening in his body had moved past the point where he could help. He was semi-conscious, his legs not responding. His breathing shallow and rapid in a way that made Elena's jaw tighten. He's going hypoxic, she said to no one in particular, because no one in particular needed to be told. Everyone with eyes could now see it. the gray undertone to his skin, the way his lips had lost color. "Get me an O2 mask." Dr. Reyes arrived at Bay 4:30 seconds after the gurney did, snapping on gloves as she walked, taking in the scene with the rapid clinical scan of someone who had made a career of rapid clinical scans. "What do we have?" "Hypoglycemic crisis, likely," Elena said, cutting away the outer jacket with practiced efficiency. "Compounded by dehydration and environmental exposure. Possible hypothermia." He was down outside for an unknown period before the officer was called. Reyes leaned in, lifted his eyelids, checked his pupils. "How long?" "Unknown. He may have been deteriorating for hours." And then Reyes paused. She had seen what Elena had seen, the dog tags now resting on the edge of the gurney, the tattoo exposed on his forearm. "Is he?" "Yes," Elena said simply. Something shifted in Reyes's face. A small, quiet hardening. The kind that happens when a professional recategorizes a situation and everything downstream of that recategorization changes. "Let's move," she said. They worked with the synchronicity of people who have done this 1,000 times, but there was something different in the room now, a particular intensity that the other nurses and technicians could feel without being able to name. Like everyone had subconsciously increased the stakes. The glucose drip went in. The warming blanket went on. Oxygen levels were being monitored in real time. Someone had cut away enough of his layers to attach cardiac leads, and the monitor above the bed began drawing the jagged green line of a heart that was working hard but working. Still working. For several minutes, the outcome was genuinely unclear. Marcus's pressure had dropped to a level that made the attending physician, Dr. Yusuf Amin, who had joined Reyes in the bay, exchange a look with the nurse on his left that said what no one was saying out loud. He was close to the edge. Not in the metaphorical way the phrase usually gets used. In the literal, clinical, right on the precipice way. And outside Bay 4, separated by a curtain and the noise of a working emergency department, Officer Daniel Pratt stood in the corridor. He hadn't left. That was the thing he could have left. His part in the official story was done. He had delivered the individual to the ER, he had released the cuffs when requested, he would write up his report and move on to the next call. But he hadn't moved. He stood with his hands at his sides and his eyes on the curtain of Bay 4, and he was doing a kind of arithmetic that had nothing to do with the training he'd received and everything to do with the part of him that was still underneath the badge and the belt and the 4 years of professional conditioning, a 27-year-old human being trying to figure out if he had done something terrible. He thought about the way the man had raised his arm on the sidewalk. He thought about how he'd read it. He thought about all the calls before it, 9 of them, and the mental calculus he'd used to arrive at the conclusion he'd arrived at in under 3 seconds and acted on in under 5. He thought about what the nurse had said. Those are not symptoms of intoxication. He stood there, and he waited. In Bay 4, 11 minutes after the glucose drip had been started, 11 minutes that had felt significantly longer to everyone in the room, Marcus Webb opened his eyes. He didn't speak immediately. His gaze went to the ceiling, then moved, slowly, taking in the room. The monitors, the 4-line, the warming blanket. He had been in rooms like this before, not as a patient but in other capacities in other countries, in circumstances no one in this room could imagine, and the familiarity of the medical environment seemed to reach through the fog and give him something to hold on to. His eyes found Elena. She was standing at the foot of the bed, chart in hand, watching him with the same steady, assessing look she'd had since the entrance. He looked at her for a long moment, and then, with the kind of effort that cost him something visible, he spoke. 2 words. Rough, barely audible. Sandpaper and distance. How long? Elena understood the question immediately. Not how long had he been in the hospital. How long had he been down on the sidewalk before someone called? "We don't know," she said. "Long enough." He closed his eyes. "Stupid," he said to himself, quietly, like a report filed with no one but his own internal standard. And Elena Vasquez, who had not yet done the thing she was going to do, recognized in that single word the particular self-discipline of a soldier who had held himself to a standard for so long that failing his own body felt like a tactical error. She looked at him. She looked at the dog tags on the edge of the gurney. She looked at the tattoo. And she made a decision. She picked up his chart. That's how it started, not with a dramatic announcement, not with a confrontation. Elena Vasquez picked up the chart that had been started by the intake process and began filling in what she knew. "Can you tell me your name?" she asked. "Webb." He didn't open his eyes. "Marcus Webb." She wrote it down. Date of birth. A pause. Then, March 4th, 1963. She did the math without looking up. 63 years old. He looked older. The outdoors and whatever else he'd carried had added years. "Are you a veteran, Mr. Webb?" Something in his face changed. A subtle tightening around the eyes, like a door that had been nudged rather than opened. "Yeah," he said. "Which branch?" "Army." Elena set the chart down. She pulled up a stool and sat at his bedside, not at the clinical distance of an assessment, but close. The kind of close that says, "I am talking to you now, not at you." "What unit?" she asked. The door opened a little more. His eyes came open. He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time with the clarity that the glucose was slowly restoring to his brain, and something changed in his expression. "You know what you're asking," he said. Not a question. "I do," she said. "A beat." 75th Ranger Regiment, he said. 2nd Battalion. After that, he stopped. A small, careful pause. After that, other places. Other things. Elena nodded slowly. "How many deployments?" 3 formal. Others that weren't. Bronze Star. His eyes sharpened. "You read my tags." "I read your arm first," she said. The tags confirmed it. Something happened in Marcus Webb's face then. Something that had nothing to do with the medical crisis or the fluorescent lights or the cold tile he'd spent the last hour pressed against. It was smaller than that, and larger. It was the expression of someone who has been invisible for so long that being seen feels physically disorienting. "You serve?" he asked. 101st Airborne, Elena said. 2 tours. Got out in 2014. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. "Nurse then?" he said. "Nurse now," she agreed. "Then I was a medic." The room was quiet except for the monitors. Bay 4 existed in its own small pocket of stillness while the rest of the ER moved around it like water around a stone. "Mr. Webb," Elena said carefully. "Your records. Do you have VA benefits? Are you enrolled?" The silence that followed was answer enough. "There were some problems," he said finally. "After I got out, some things happened. It got complicated." The bureaucratic understatement of a man who had clearly spent years navigating a system designed, in theory, to serve him and in practice to exhaust him. Elena nodded. She didn't push. She had heard some version of the story more times than she could count. Not because veterans came through Mercy General ER frequently, but because she had made it her business, in the years since her own discharge, to know what happened to people like her after the uniform came off. She knew what complicated meant. It meant a system that asked for documentation from people who had lost everything. It meant appointments missed because there was no address to receive the letter. It meant a benefits process that moved at the speed of institutional indifference while the person waiting on the other end of it moved at the speed of a life in freefall. She pulled out a small notebook from her scrubs pocket. "I'm going to write some names and numbers down," she said. "People who can help navigate this. When you're stable, we're going to talk about next steps. Okay?" Marcus watched her write. "You don't have to," he started. "I know I don't have to," she said without looking up. "I want to." Outside the curtain, something was happening. Word travels in an emergency room the way it travels in any small, closed community, person to person, in fragments, each piece landing and expanding. Elena had not made any announcements. She had not told anyone anything formally. But nurses talk, staff talk, and the question of who the man in Bay 4 actually was had quietly moved through the department in the way these things do. The intake clerk had looked up his name once a social security number had been tentatively matched through a state identification system. What she found had made her stop typing. She had printed the result and walked it quietly to Dr. Reyes. Dr. Reyes had read it. She had said nothing for a moment. And then she had gone to find Officer Pratt, who was still standing in the corridor outside Bay 4 with his hands at his sides and his face doing something complicated. She handed him the printed page. He took it. Read it. His face changed. Marcus Alexander Webb, United States Army, retired. Rank, Master Sergeant. Service dates spanning from 1985 to 2011. Deployments to Panama, Iraq, Afghanistan. Awards and decorations including the Bronze Star with Valor device. Not just the Bronze Star, but with Valor, meaning it had been awarded for acts of courage under direct enemy fire. 2 Purple Hearts. The Army Commendation Medal. The Combat Infantryman Badge. 26 years. 26 years of service. Daniel Pratt read the page twice. He handed it back to Dr. Reyes without speaking. She left him with it. And in Bay 4, Elena Vasquez capped her pen, closed her notebook, and looked at the man in the bed. Still pale, still diminished by what his body had been through, still in the tattered clothes of a man the city had learned not to see. She made a decision. She stood up. She straightened her back. And she raised her right hand. The salute was not a dramatic gesture. That's what made it devastating. Elena Vasquez did not make an announcement. She did not wait for an audience. She stood beside the bed of a man who had not yet fully returned to himself. Still foggy, still fragile, oxygen flowing through the mask on his face, monitors marking out the rhythm of a heart that had nearly given out on a sidewalk where strangers had stepped over him. And she brought her hand up to her brow with the precision of someone for whom this gesture was not ceremonial but fluent. The way you do something 10,000 times until it becomes part of your body. Marcus Webb opened his eyes. He saw her. He didn't move at first. His eyes tracked upward from the warming blanket, to the 4-line, to her face, to her raised hand. The specific geometry of a military salute, the angle, the posture, the stillness cut through whatever remained of the fog. His throat worked. He tried to move his right arm. It was slow. The glucose hadn't fully restored what hours of crisis had depleted, but he lifted it. Trembling, deliberate, his elbow never quite fully extended. His wrist wasn't steady, but his hand reached his brow. He returned it. Elena held hers for a moment longer than necessary. Then she lowered it. Neither of them said anything for several seconds. The curtain of Bay 4 rippled in the movement of the ER around them. Somewhere behind it, a phone rang. Someone called out a medication request. The ordinary machinery of the night continued. But inside that curtain, something had happened that couldn't be unmade. Dr. Reyes, who had returned quietly and stood just outside the bay, had seen it through the gap in the curtain. She didn't move for a moment. Then she stepped away, clearing her throat. The 2 nurses who had been at the station nearest Bay 4 had seen it. The intake clerk who had printed the page had been standing near the hallway entrance, and she had seen it. Officer Daniel Pratt had seen it. He had moved, sometime in the last few minutes without fully deciding to, from the corridor to the edge of the waiting area closest to Bay 4. He was still in his uniform, still wearing the equipment of authority. But his hands were different now. Not at his sides in the controlled stance of an officer on duty. Hanging. Heavy. He watched the curtain settle. And something moved across his face. Something that had no professional category, that his training hadn't prepared him for, that was simply the experience of a 27-year-old human being understanding, in real time, the specific weight of a mistake made from speed and assumption and the accumulated fatigue of a long night. He had put a decorated combat veteran, a man who had received the Bronze Star with Valor, a man who had served for 26 years, a man who had been shot and kept going, face down on a hospital floor. He had read a raised arm as aggression. He had not asked a single question. He had not seen the man. The knowledge sat on him like something physical. Inside the bay, Elena was talking to Marcus again, practical, forward-facing, already moving into logistics. She had names written in her notebook. A veterans outreach coordinator she trusted. A social worker on the overnight shift who specialized in housing navigation. A VA patient advocate who owed her a favor and answered texts at midnight. Marcus listened. He was more present now, the glucose doing its quiet biochemical work, the warmth returning to his extremities, his eyes tracking with something closer to their usual sharpness. He was watching her move, not with the passivity of a patient. with the assessment of someone who has spent a significant portion of his life evaluating the people around him for capability and character. "You didn't have to do that," he said when she paused. "The salute. I know. People don't usually." He stopped, reorganized. "It's been a while." She looked at him directly. "How long have you been on the street?" The pause was long enough that she thought he might not answer. 14 months, he said finally. "Approximately. What happened?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the ER noise filled the space. He looked at the ceiling. "Lot of things," he said. "In a lot of order." She waited. "Lost the apartment when I lost the job. Lost the job when I lost the—" He paused again. His jaw moved. "When some things got hard to manage. There's a name for it now. PTSD. Back when I was in, we had a different name." "What was the name?" A ghost of something crossed his face. Not quite a smile. "Too worn for that. But something." "We didn't talk about it," he said. "That was the name." Elena Vasquez nodded. She understood that language precisely. She had spoken it herself, for several years after she got out, before she found different words. "We're going to fix some things tonight," she said. "Not everything, but some things." Marcus looked at her. "Why?" It was an honest question, the kind only someone who has been let down enough times would think to ask. She held his gaze. "Because this is what should have happened the first time you came home," she said. Marcus Webb looked at the ceiling again. His chest rose and fell. He didn't say anything else, but his jaw unclenched. And some long-held, long-necessary tension, left his shoulders. At 2:14 in the morning, Officer Daniel Pratt knocked on the frame of Bay 4. The curtain was partially open. Marcus was sitting up now, not fully, still connected to the monitors, but upright against the raised hospital bed. The color had returned to his face. His eyes were clear. Elena was at the corner of the room, updating his chart. Pratt stepped in. He was holding his hat in both hands. His patrol cap, which he had taken off outside the curtain, in the specific gesture of a man who has decided to remove the armor before he speaks. Marcus looked at him. Pratt met his gaze and didn't look away. "Mr. Webb," he said. His voice was steady, but it cost him something to keep it that way. "My name is Daniel Pratt. I'm the officer who—" He stopped. "I'm the officer from outside." Marcus said nothing. "I was given your service record," Pratt continued. I want to say I'm sorry for how I handled the situation outside. I made assumptions that I shouldn't have made. I didn't ask questions. I should have." A beat. "I'm sorry," he said again, simply, without qualification. The silence in Bay 4 stretched out. Marcus looked at the young officer for a long moment. Long enough to make Pratt hold himself very still, absorbing it. "You were tired," Marcus said finally. Pratt blinked. "Sir, I've had soldiers under my command who were tired make mistakes," Marcus said, with the deliberate evenness of someone choosing their words from a very large and carefully organized vocabulary. Tired and inexperienced is a dangerous combination. It doesn't excuse the mistake, but it explains it. Pratt absorbed this. "You could have been hurt worse," Pratt said. "I could have. But I wasn't," Marcus said. "And you came back." Something shifted in Pratt's face. "That matters," Marcus said. "Coming back. A lot of people don't." Elena was not writing in the chart anymore. She was simply standing in the corner of the room, witnessing. Pratt put his hat back on. He straightened slightly, and then, with the careful precision of someone who had Googled the protocol on his phone in the hallway and practiced it twice before walking through the curtain, he brought his hand up. He saluted. It wasn't perfect. The angle was slightly off. He wasn't trained for it in the same way. But it was genuine. It was deliberate. It was given with everything a 27-year-old man who had just fully understood the weight of his own humanity could give. Marcus Webb, sitting in a hospital bed at 2 in the morning, tubes still in his arm, fog still clearing from a body that had nearly given out on a cold sidewalk, looked at the officer holding the salute. And for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, he smiled. Marcus Webb was discharged from Mercy General 2 days later. He was not discharged to a street corner. Elena Vasquez had made 4 phone calls during that shift alone. By the time Marcus walked out of the hospital, he had a temporary housing placement, a VA enrollment appointment, and the name of a counselor who specialized in combat veterans, a man who was himself a veteran of Fallujah, which Elena had considered when she made the call. She walked him to the exit. At the door, he stopped. He turned. And he saluted her. She returned it without hesitation. That was how they said goodbye. Here is what I want to leave you with. Marcus Webb had walked past thousands of people in 14 months. Thousands of eyes that slid over him like water over stone. Thousands of split-second judgments made by people who were tired or busy or simply running the same quiet calculation we all run. This person is not my problem. It took one person who knew how to look. One person who had carried the same weight and recognized it in a stranger's arm. One salute. I want to ask you something, and I want you to really think about it before you scroll away. When was the last time you really looked, at someone the world had decided wasn't worth seeing? Tell me in the comments, because I think your answer might surprise you.